Welcome to another podcast, and today we have a special guest who's Jeremy Saltan, who is running under Naftali Bennett's Yamina party. First of all, welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Of course. Thanks for having me, Neil.
So first of all, that's a Chicago accent, if I'm
That's
not
right.
wrong on my American accents. Let's go back. Why did you make Aliyah? I think everyone who's English speaking in Israel or even thinking about making Aliyah has their own reasons. Why did you make Aliyah and at the end of the day decide to stand for Knesset?
So, I made Aliyah with my family. It was a week before the sixth grade. So I can't say that my opinion was the one that mattered when it came to making that decision as a family.
You're a result of the decisions of your parents.
Yes, but of course, I am standing before you here now, so obviously that is by choice. There's a common joke here in Israel that there are a lot of people that are trying to get a visa, let alone an American citizenship. I actually had a girl that I dated one time, and she admitted later on that the only reason she was dating me was because she was hoping, to get American citizenship out of it, and it convinced me to move back. So, I'm a Zionist. I would have been here by choice had I not been brought,
What is Zionism for you?
For me, Zionism is being able to live as a Jewish man in the Jewish land, building the Jewish country. That's to me what Zionism is.
Okay.
Yeah.
So look, these the elections, if we're jumping into contemporary politics,
Sure.
But I mean, on the fourth one in 2 years, it kind of gets repetitive. But I think these ones are really quite interesting because if you look at the polls, Naftali Bennett, your boss, could be the kingmaker. He could decide whether Bibi goes or Bibi stays. There's a song there, something about, is it time to go now? And so is it time to go now? If people vote Naftali Bennett, will he support Bibi? Because if that's important, otherwise they could vote Gideon Saar.
So there are four people running to be prime minister of the state of Israel. Of course, it's a three-phase process in terms of choosing the prime minister. What the citizens can do, and they only get one vote, and that's to vote for the legislative branch, which is the Knesset. And we're saying very clearly that we're running for prime minister. The second phase is the president's residence. And we're saying regardless of the amount of votes that we get, obviously we're hoping to get a lot of votes and be as big as possible, but regardless of where we fall between the four prime minister candidates, we're going to nominate Naftali Bennett as a party, Yamina, in the president's residence. So what's going to happen in terms of the third phase, which is the vote of confidence, right? In a parliamentary system, you have to have the confidence. The government needs to have the confidence of the parliament in order to be able to survive. There's a lot of things that happen between that second and third phase, right? We call that horse trading back in Chicago.
Okay, well, you've eloquently not answered the question. Because the reality is, Naftali Bennett last week said, I'm looking for a government which is a laumi, a national government, if you like. And he also referred to the numbers. So if they had a lot of them, I believe you're number 16. So if you're in the Knesset, then he will go stand for president, stand for prime minister, etc. If it's more or less a hung government where he's the kingmaker, Naftali Bennett will go for Bibi, surely.
No, what he said is he's going to do what's best for the people of Israel. Now, what is going to be best for the people of Israel? It's hard to determine when we don't know what the election results are. You're correct, and you mentioned Gideon Saar, that he's already ruling people out right now. We heard him both rule out Bibi. He also ruled out on Saturday night, sitting with Yair Lapid. Also, it's not very clear exactly what type of a government you would get if you're voting for Gideon Saar at this point, quite frankly, if you're trying to make a contrast between the two of us. But we're saying it is something that we can actually stand behind. And that is, we know what we're going to do in the first phase. We know what we're going to do in the second phase. We're going to just see based on what the results are in the first two before determining what we're going to do in the third. Look, in the last three elections, we've had people say they're going to sit with Bibi, and then they didn't. We had people say they're not going to sit with Bibi, and then they did. And really, I think people are so jaded They're so cynical at this point.
So,
The best
so you're
thing
not
that we can
committed.
do, yeah, the best thing we can do is be honest and say, look, we don't want to have a fifth election. That's for sure. Having 4 elections in 2 years, add COVID to the mix. Our financial situation is not the best ever. Okay, so we don't want to have a fifth election. On the other hand, we don't want to have some sort of government that is held up by Balad, which with all of their MKs, apparently the prerequisite for going to jail is to first being a Balad MK. Okay, and so we don't want to have anything like that either. So we're going to see what the election results are, and if there's something we have learned over the last 3 elections before this, what we've seen in the polls is not necessarily indicative of what we're going to see in the election results. So I think that's also in terms of trying to figure out this horse race and who's ahead of who and who's going to sit with who and whatever. I think it's very difficult to do this now. And if we look on prior records, look, anyone that's saying anything now in terms of where they're going to be in the third phase, they're either a liar, naive, or intentionally trying to bring us to a fifth election. Those are the only options that I see.
What's interesting is also your agenda, like if you get elected, what your actual agenda would be. Let's have a look at a couple of things. First of all, education. Naftali Bennett was the education minister, and somewhat controversial. I think everyone's controversial if they're an educational minister. Let's just look at one thing. When he was the education minister, he started preventing speakers addressing school children. And he said quite clearly, and the issue was with breaking the silence, and he was saying, I want a Zionist nationalist agenda. And let me quote you. He said, I want to prevent speakers that harm the legitimacy of Israel as a Jewish democratic state from speaking to students and Israeli students. How do you define legitimacy of Israel?
I think he just did. We recognize Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. That is the way that every institution, if you're looking at the Supreme Court, Aaron Barak, all the way down to really just about every MK in the Knesset, with of course the exception of the joint list. That's the way that everyone defines it. You go to any university here, you go to any high school here, you take the civics exam for the Bagrut, at the end of high school. That's how everything has always been. And it's true that until Naftali Bennett was education minister, there would be people who would come into the classrooms and they would go ahead and try to show a different type of model of how they view Israel. I can tell you someone.
What's wrong with that?
I can tell you as someone who grew up in the United States, right? I had to, besides singing the national anthem of Osei, so I also had to pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and so on and so forth. There was no one coming into the school talking about criticizing America and its identity and the way that the curriculum has been chosen. Now I understand that's a concept that perhaps in certain liberal democracies within Europe that's considered an acceptable thing. But in most democracies, you don't have that.
There is a problem with the example you gave. If we talk specifically about breaking the silence, or Israelis who served in the army, and they said they refused to strengthen the occupation in their terminology, right? Surely for students who are going to serve in the army, if you want to have some form of democratic and understanding of democracy, you don't have to understand. You can understand, but not agree. Why is?
So again, I would ask the same thing. In the UK, would you allow that in the UK schools? In the US, would they allow that in US schools? People who I'm sure even if you ask Bernie Sanders, he would be against putting people in the school system and telling people they shouldn't enlist and be part of the US Army just because they don't want to serve in Iraq or Afghanistan. I've never heard that type of thing in terms of putting the education system. Again, we're democracy. You can have these opinions. If you want to go ahead and influence the youth, you can do so in other methods. But for principals to go ahead and bring them into the schools, that's an issue. And it's important to say that this wasn't done out of context. What Naftali Bennett did was he did this along the side of increasing the autonomy that principals have in terms of being able to bring additional curriculum and additional values and certain things into the schools that principals couldn't do beforehand. But before he granted them additional autonomy, he said, listen, there's important Zionistic based value that we see Israel as a Jewish and a democratic state, and that's a red line. And I'm going to allow you as a principal to bring in a lot more in terms of format and content that you've been used to, but you're not going to go ahead and start educating people against the values that this entire state has been based on. So it wasn't that it was just done out of context.
If I can interrupt you for a second, do you draw the same line on the other side? In other words, going back to our original point, if we get Bennett, we may get Netanyahu. If we get Netanyahu, we may get the Kahanists, Ben Gvir. Okay, which I don't know if you remember age-wise. I remember Ben Gvir standing with the emblem of Yitzhak Rabin's Mercedes and saying, in the same way we got the emblem off of his car, we will get to the prime minister just before the assassination. So he's a very dangerous man. Would you stop him going into schools? Would Naftali Bennett sit with Ben Gvir in a government?
As far as I understand, Ben Gvir isn't being invited by anyone into schools, so we don't have to worry about that. And he's quite obviously not. But
he's sitting in governments.
So again, we said very clearly, anyone who goes ahead and accepts Israel as a Jewish and democratic state can be in the government. Ben Gvir is a student of Kahana. Kahana wrote the book Against Democracy. So I think you would even have to ask.
Say no.
I'm saying you'd have to ask Ben Gvir if he accepts Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, because we're being very clear in terms of what it is that we're putting as a condition. And I think he himself would tell you that he doesn't live up to that condition, and therefore he would not be a member of the government. I would also mention, though, that it was
he could be a member of the coalition. He could be a member of the coalition. In other words, Netanyahu.
I see it as very difficult. I see it as a very difficult scenario that we're gonna see a scenario in both. Let's understand the steps they have to go here. Number one, that Ben Gvir himself decides that he accepts Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. Number two, that he's able to convince us that he indeed accepts Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. Number three, that we sit down for some sort of coalition talks and that we actually have enough to be able to agree upon on actually forming a government with him. Let's remember the conditions that Naftali Bennett has put for this next government, and that is to take the traditional right-left arguments and put them to the side so that we can deal with COVID from both a health and an economic perspective. Based on the ads that Ben Gvir just ran against us, where he's accusing Bennett of sitting with Hitler, Neil, I just don't know where you're living in that you expect the two of us to be in the same coalition. And again, you can just ask Ben Gvir to clarify why he thinks he can do that. I'm quite sure using Nazi terminology within political ads is something that has been, deemed illegal by a number of different laws within the Knesset. But of course, if he puts it online and it's not on a TV ad, maybe there's a loophole there. But I think the moral issue is quite clear.
The question of Naftali Bennett when he was defense minister is interesting. He became a defense minister, seemed very inexperienced, somewhat uncomfortable in his role. What would you say to the accusation that under the auspices of Naftali Bennett as defense minister, Hezbollah in the north got even stronger?
I would say that's a ridiculous charge. If anything, I think he was the best defense minister we've had in over 20 years. We have Iran on our board. Let's look at his record. It was under his time that they stopped those fence protests in Gaza. Okay, that was happening every single week, the entire term that Netanyahu was there, dating back to the time in Lieberman. It ended during Bennett's time. Okay, that's an important thing to look at. If you look at the retreat that Iran had from Syria, because of the increased activity there. And of course, I'm not at liberty to say exactly what activity was there, but if you read a lot of foreign media, you have a quite good picture in terms of what happened in Syria and the Iranian retreat from there. So I think also that's something that should be looked upon in terms of his record. And if you're looking at the Lebanese side, there was no incident at all when it came to the Lebanese side. And in fact, there was a lot of activity between the Syrian border and Lebanon in terms of what would perhaps be, right, I'll put that in in quotations, perhaps be whatever rearming of Lebanon or various organizations within Lebanon that might be coming in from various actors from the Syrian border. So I would for sure go ahead and also say over there that that's ridiculous. I would also point out that the increased cooperation that we had both with the Egyptians and the Jordanians, specifically during Bennett's term. And of course, as defense minister during the COVID crisis, it was him who took charge and started a lot of the things that no one did beforehand. He was dealing with putting on face masks and talking about that before Netanyahu was. He was telling old people that they need to be extra careful before the government was saying that. He was the one that started the Corona hotel program. He's the one who suggested the traffic light program, which was only adopted 6 months later on. He was the first one to talk about the rapid testing system, which Netanyahu resisted. I think his record is very solid as defense minister. And again, the most successful we've had in 20 years.
How would Bennett deal with the Haredim? Because that's a core of the problem with COVID.
He has a program both on the economic and on the health side. In terms of the health side, what he wants to do is a 180-degree shift from what Netanyahu is doing. What Netanyahu is doing is he's trying to close off the red cities. And there's a problem with that logic because someone from a green city goes to a red city and then they go back to the green city and make it red. What Bennett wants to do is do the opposite. He wants to take green cities and separate them from the red and create green islands. He uses the analogy of cleaning for Pesach. Okay, spring cleaning. You clean a room, you make sure that you don't bring any food into that room that you've cleaned, and slowly but surely you go ahead and you clean the rest of the house until everything is clean. That's how most people try to clean their house, and that's the same way you have to act with COVID. What you can do, and we have the capacity now to have 2 million tests per day, is to be able to give the local level, the mayors, who know how to get to people a lot better than the national government do, to give them the ability to test everyone, isolate who does still have COVID.
Hold on. Again, yes. You're eloquently not answering the question which I asked you at the beginning.
No, I'm getting to the Haredim because the problem with the Haredim are in the red cities. And in order to deal with the red cities,
let's be specific so I can help you answer the question. I'll be specific so I can help you answer the question. Which was that was quite a long not answer. If you're saying let the local municipalities deal with it, okay?
Yes.
Take Bnei Brak, take Beitar, my neighbors, okay? They're in denial. They're saying open up the yeshivot. Not because the government, not because of Naftali Bennett, but because of a rabbi says, hey, we got to go and study Torah. Now, what's interesting is Naftali Bennett represents modern orthodoxy, the combination of study of Torah, yet at the same time, supposedly recognizing democracy. My question is very specific. How do you deal with the rabbis who are saying, ignore what the government is saying, go back, open the shivot because we can't stop studying Torah? Would you arrest a leader? Would you arrest a leading rabbi? Yes or no?
No. So I'm explaining what you do because what you need to do is you have to convince the regular person to try to think that you're going to be able to, round up a few people and that's going to convince the masses. I don't think that's necessarily the right answer. In terms of opening places up, if you're talking about educational institutions and so forth, what we have said is instead of the current situation of just having fines, if someone opens up a public institution, right, or an educational, a school or whatever it is, that you need to have you have to have a criminal responsibility attached to the person who opens it up in the morning with the keys. That's something that you can do, and that's a simple rule of law thing. And that has nothing to do with who someone is listening to or not. And in many cases, there are various levels within the chain of command. And the person who it's on the criminal responsibility for him to open in the morning, he's going to think, once or twice before he does that, if he knows that that's what's going to happen, instead of a fine that he can always throw on someone else. What I'm saying here is you have to understand the masses. How do you convince the masses to listen to the rule of law and to the situation of following the guidelines of Corona? If in Bnei Brak, they see a green city next to them in Ramat Gan and Petach Tikva and Givatayim, where everything is open because there are 0 cases, and they are stuck in a red zone where they are still burying their dead, where they're still not able to open anything up, or if they do, there are consequences for doing so. They're going to look left, right, north, and south and say, you know what? we're going to start putting pressure on our leaders, whether it's their local leaders, whether it's the rabbinical leaders, or wherever it is that they need to within the community. That's how you're able to convince them to move from red to green.
Jeremy, you're wrong. I disagree
with you. I'm telling you that you're wrong.
No, that's okay. Where I disagree with Anna, is that may be right for your supporters, because within the modern Orthodoxy, there's an understanding of what's a Jewish democratic state. I put on my kippah, I go to synagogue, I daven 3 times a day, and I go to work, right? Within the Haredi community, there is studying Torah, a reliance on the woman of the household for parnasah, for income. Yet my reason of being is to study yeshiva, at the yeshiva, to study Torah. If my rabbi is turning around and saying, go study, the idea of, hey, they've got things open and not, is a modern Western value. And so that's why I'm challenging you, is whether that plan really works.
That's fine to challenge me on this. I'll tell you that I know Haredi society better than you think I do. One of the positions that I hold right now, I sit on the Regional Planning and Building Committee of the Harel region within the Jerusalem district. And I have to deal with Arab villages like Abu Ghosh, and I need to deal with Haredi villages like Telstone, Kiryat Yarim. And I can tell you that, also working with the mayor of Kiryat Yarim of Telstone, that yes, you can, by doing this system, you can convince people that it's in their best interest. Look, there have been plenty of stories that you can see based on the Telstone model. It's been in the press of how the mayor, based on pressure that he got from his own constituents, and perhaps you can say maybe it's because there are a few American Haredim that are in Telstone that did that. But what ended up happening was there was pressure. The mayor decided to go ahead on a program in which he was able to go ahead and almost completely clean the entire city. And it was the only Haredi city to be able to do so. But I'm saying that, what worked in Telstone, it can work in Beitar, it can work in Emmanuel, it can work in Matitya, because you want to know what, at the end of the day, the majority of Telstone is still Israeli Haredim, and 100% of Telstone, 100% is Haredi. It's not like you can't do it. And in Abu Ghosh, it's a very similar situation also in the Arab community. So again, what you need to be able to do is, and this is a thing in politics, when your base tells you to do something, you got to listen to your base. So if you convince the base that something is important, and it's not about a value. Again, notice what's in the plan here. They're going to look at everyone around them. Now, you're right. They're studying Torah and everything is great. You're talking about the Lithuanian sect in which the women go to work. In a lot of the Hasidic sects, it's actually the women aren't allowed to go to work. It's usually the man. But what you have is a situation where they're living in the same household, and they're going to start to have some kitchen table discussions. And yeah, a lot of that stuff is going to end up going up to the various leaders, whether it's the regional leaders within the municipalities, or it's the rabbinical leadership, or it's other leaders. Because, a lot of times there are other people that sway public opinion other than the rabbis and the mayors and city council people. It depends on the village or the town or the city. So again, that's how you do it. What we don't believe in, and this is an important point, because I know that there are a lot of people like Lapid and Lieberman who do believe in this, is that they believe that if you coerce someone, you're going to be able to convince them. And what we've seen time and time again is every time we've tried to force somebody, we've not been able to successfully do that. Israel's history is filled with examples of us trying to force somebody to do something, them not wanting to do it, and the state having a colossal failure. So you might not like my model, even though, like I said, it has been tested in a small area and it has worked with the same, population. But the other alternative, in terms of what people are suggesting, that has just simply not worked.
On the question of your picture's frozen, but we can hear you, so we'll carry on. I think the difference between us is perhaps you're much more optimistic than, and perhaps I'm a little bit more cynical on the chances. But I hope you're right, because at the end of the day, we only have one Jewish country, and I think it's a shame that some people forget that we're one people dealing with one problem. It's the Jewish people fighting corona. It's not ultra-Orthodox. It's not Haredim. It's not modern whatever you like. It's the Jewish people in the land of Israel seeking to survive and save Jews. Jeremy, are you still with us? So for those of you who are listening and go, hey, just what happened, or was watching this, because this is going to be on YouTube as well. Hey, we're in 2021 and it's Zoom and it is internet speed. So do we have a guarantee that if you are in the Knesset, you can do something about the internet speed, Jeremy?
For sure.
That's it. You got my vote. You got me. We get quicker internet. You got my vote.
Neil, the amount of times first of all, right, it's crazy because of COVID and everything. We're having these discussions instead of having them in person. But I'll tell you, this has just been ridiculous. This is probably not only have we been having this, but I've talked to people in other parties, and we've also had panels with people from different candidates. In the middle of an answer, you'll just have someone cut out. This is something that needs to be dealt with. I think it's crazy. We're the innovation nation. We're the startup nation. And yet we can't even have normal infrastructure to be able to have normal internet speeds like every other normal country does. So for sure, that's going to be one of the things that I'm going to be working on. If not, for any other reason, just so that by the next election, which will hopefully be in 4 years, not in 4 months, we'll be able to have an easier time.
Thank you for that. So we are, unfortunately, we have to wrap up. It's been great speaking to you. And it really is, I think many people will agree with the feeling is we can agree, we can disagree. I can say you're wrong, you can say I'm wrong. At the end of the day, there's two things. One, I think it's important that we have politicians who stand for their ideology, their belief. We can understand, we don't necessarily have to agree. That's the basis of what I'm committed to, which is education. And second of all is quality politicians who are interested in not themselves, but serving the people. And I think we certainly got a taste of that today. Last question. What is the most important thing to do in Israel if you've got some free time? Because we all have a little bit more free time, unless you're standing for election. And then you've got no time because we keep having elections. What's the one thing you recommend now that things are starting to open up and things are looking good because we've got elections, so everything has to be good now? What would you?
I would say be enjoying, just the national wonders that we have in Israel. If that's going down to the Dead Sea, if it's going to the Kinneret, we've all had some good quality time, for good or for bad, with our immediate family. I think this is a good time. I think for a lot of us, it'd be good to take the family out and just experience Israel and just go to one of those places that we're really connected to. And again, for some people, it might, of course, be the Kotel or a religious site. For others, like I said, it might be some sort of, beautiful natural point. But get out and get connected back to the land of Israel. Because again, as a Zionist, that's what I'm doing here. That's what I hope all of us are here. That's why, that's what it's about. So that's what I would suggest to everyone. Just, connect again with the land of Israel. Get out of your homes and just connect with the great places that we have here.
Jeremy, it's been a pleasure speaking to you today, and hopefully we'll see you as member of Knesset in a few months' time. And finally, I ask everyone we speak to who's a politician, just to be fair, what are the letters of the party?
Of course, thanks. Our party name is Yamina, and our letter is Bet. Bet for Bennett.
Enjoy. Thank you, Jeremy. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Neil.